The Battle of Naseby, last gamble of King Charles I. How does a king's ambition turn a battlefield into a breaking point? Picture England, 1645. King Charles I, a monarch desperate to secure his throne, now finds himself at a crossroads. Chased from Oxford, hunted by the relentless Parliamentarians, he plots his next move. One final all-or-nothing clash at Naseby. But what he doesn't know is that Parliament's newly formed, fiercely disciplined new model army, led by the indomitable Fairfax and the iron-willed Cromwell, is more than ready to meet him. What happens when a king's last hope faces off against a force designed to crush his power? As dawn breaks over the hills of Northamptonshire, both armies stand poised for battle. The Royalists, smaller in number and lacking their northern allies, rely on sheer willpower. Meanwhile, Cromwell and Fairfax survey the battlefield with wry confidence, that daring Charles to make his final play. Will the Parliamentarians' precision shatter the Royalist resolve? Or will King Charles pull a miracle from his hat and turn the tide? And what of that mad escape from Oxford and the game of cat and mouse along Cropredy Bridge? As armies charge and loyalties teeter on the brink, every moment at Naseby holds the fate of England in its grip. The spark was inevitable, like tinder awaiting a careless spark. The year was 1642, and all across England, the reign of King Charles I was crumbling. The man on the throne, Charles, with his lofty belief in the divine right to rule, had turned Parliament into a mere formality, a thing to nod along, not challenge him. Charles's rule felt like an iron fist, and Parliament's patience was wearing thin. His response? In a breathtakingly bold move, Charles tried to arrest 5 members of Parliament. At Parliament itself. Picture it. 5 stunned MPs hiding as the king's men stormed through the hallowed halls. But instead of silencing his critics, Charles had only fanned the flames. England was officially on the path to war. On the run. From that day on, Charles found himself dodging his own subjects like a fox hunted across the countryside. His seat of power in Oxford turned into a revolving door of close calls, especially as Parliament's armies closed in. After every near miss, Charles, determined and stubborn as ever, just slipped away, slipping out of Oxford under the cover of night, escaping to Worcester with only his dignity and dwindling followers in tow. His pursuers, William Waller and the Earl of Essex, followed at every turn. Rumor had it Waller had taken up the pursuit with a personal vendetta against Charles, calling every near miss just another delay. Meanwhile, in Lyme, Parliament knew they had to push their advantage, and Essex got a special mission: relieve the Royalist siege on Lyme. Essex's men fought like devils, pushing back the Royalists and turning their siege into a ruinous memory. Afterward, he regrouped, breathless and battle-worn, to lift yet another siege, this time the Royalist grip on Plymouth. But what was next would be his undoing. Driven by pride and, perhaps a little overconfidence, Essex made a bold march right into Royalist Cornwall, a hornet's nest of hostile forces. With no help nearby, Essex was trapped, an isolated figure amidst hostile ground, surrounded by Royalists. In a dramatic, almost laughable twist of fate, he abandoned his army under the cover of night, rowing away across the sea while his soldiers left behind watched his tiny boat bob off into the distance. They fought valiantly, but in the end, Lostwithiel marked a painful defeat for the Parliamentarians. The remaining men were compelled to surrender, and Charles had scored a rare, morale-boosting victory. Almost doesn't count. Late October saw Charles cornered once again. This time, his back was truly against the wall as he faced a Parliamentarian force nearly twice the size of his own. The Second Battle of Newbury raged with every ounce of desperation Charles could muster. Parliament's Manchester, tasked with taking him down, hesitated in a fateful pause, unable to deliver the final blow. Charles seized the opportunity, slipping away with a smirk and a nod to his men. The Parliamentarians could barely contain their frustration, their commander-in-chief Manchester facing harsh criticism for letting the elusive king escape once more. It was becoming a pattern, and Parliament wasn't laughing. Cromwell and Fairfax's ace in the hole. By winter, Parliament was done playing games. Oliver Cromwell, a fierce man who'd grown into military prowess through sheer grit, and Thomas Fairfax, a noble with an unshakable sense of duty, came together to form the new model army. This army wasn't like any other. a professionally trained, disciplined force driven by loyalty and unshakable purpose. Cromwell and Fairfax knew that for Parliament to prevail, they needed more than just numbers. They needed a cohesive, unbreakable spirit in their men. They assembled an army unlike any England had seen. 12 regiments of foot soldiers and an impressive cavalry, outfitted and trained to be Parliament's sword and shield. As Cromwell observed his forces, he reportedly quipped to Fairfax, "This is where the war is won, Thomas, by men with purpose, not titles." Fairfax's response? A slow nod and a hint of a rare smile. They knew their army would be Parliament's ultimate trump card. Charles knew he needed an ace of his own, and so he turned to the Irish, forging an alliance that brought 2,000 mercenaries under the Earl of Antrim to his side. These warriors, battle-hardened in Ireland's brutal conflicts, sailed to the Scottish shores with Alistair MacCalla leading them. Fiery and uncompromising, MacCalla rallied Highland clans, creating a dangerous alliance that sent a shiver down Parliament's spine. As MacCalla's forces surged through Scotland, they laid waste to cities and routed Covenanter forces with savage efficiency. Charles's newly gained momentum left Parliament scrambling, even as Montrose joined MacCalla, slicing a bloody path northward and driving a wedge between the Scottish Covenanters and their English parliamentarian allies. In June 1645, King Charles I stood at one of the most desperate crossroads of his life, stranded between the encroaching New Model army and a kingdom's worth of dwindling resources. From his stronghold in Oxford, Charles faced a landscape as bleak as his fortunes, stretched thin and filled with skeptical soldiers. The king needed either a miracle or something brash enough to seem like one. Enter his next best option, a march to Stow-on-the-Wold. As the king gathered his forces, he assembled two of the Royalists' most infamous figures, each a legend in his own right. Prince Rupert, his cavalry commander, had a reputation for boldness that bordered on recklessness and a headstrong approach that earned him as many groans as it did victories. Alongside him was Lord George Goring, an eccentric veteran who could rally men to battle with dramatic speeches, a hearty laugh, and, if it was late enough in the evening, a questionable story or two. As the two rode up to Charles, they exchanged a glance that said, "Who could be mad enough to try and win this?" Arriving at Stow-on-the-Wold under a dreary English sky, the Royalists held a council of war. Charles gathered his commanders, who promptly launched into a loud debate on their next move. Goring, peering over a map he'd just managed to unfold with a flourish, was adamant. "West," he boomed, gesturing dramatically at the paper. "We take Taunton, seize control, and give Parliament a good scare." Rupert rolled his eyes, not sold on the idea of a sidestep to Taunton. "If we head north," Rupert countered, "we'll rally fresh troops along the way and hit them where it hurts. Isn't that why we're here?" His voice trailed off with just enough disdain to make Goring scoff. Charles, taking a deep breath, finally raised a hand, silencing them both. "Gentlemen, we'll split our forces. Goring, you take 3,000 horses west to Taunton. Rupert, you'll come north with me." Goring raised an eyebrow. "Righto then. Good luck, Your Majesty. North or west, let's hope one of us finds that miracle." And so, Charles and Rupert struck north, the king clinging to the hope that allies might yet emerge from the countryside and that destiny, or maybe providence, still favored his crown. Meanwhile, on the opposite side, Parliament's Committee of Safety was scratching its collective head, trying to guess the king's intentions. General Thomas Fairfax paced, frustrated. He itched for a confrontation, but Parliament's orders were clear. Shadow the king carefully, wait for the right moment, and don't act rashly. The new, vaunted New Model army could hardly afford a reckless loss. In a cunning feint, Charles abandoned his northern path and swung southeast to Leicester, an important parliamentary garrison. Fairfax, realizing the shift, ordered a reluctant diversion, sending some forces to reinforce Taunton. Meanwhile, Cromwell's cavalry, lurking nearby, kept a close eye on the king. Charles made quick work of Leicester, bombarding the city for 2 long days until the walls buckled, allowing his troops to storm through in a whirlwind of cannon fire and musket blasts. The Royalists secured the city, but the toll was steep. 400 men dead, more wounded, and worse still, desertions thinned his ranks as soldiers took advantage of their victory to disappear into the countryside with pockets full of spoils. Join us on an unforgettable journey to uncover the powerful stories that have shaped humanity, from epic battles to defining moments of courage and sacrifice. Each of our videos is crafted to pull you into the heart of history, allowing you to witness firsthand the triumphs and tragedies of those who came before us. By subscribing, you'll become part of a passionate community dedicated to preserving our shared heritage. Gain exclusive access to thought-provoking narratives, breathtaking visuals, and hidden stories that offer fresh perspectives on the past. Every notification brings you closer to thrilling discoveries and profound insights that might just change how you view history and the world around you. Subscribe now, and let's explore the secrets of our past together. After surveying the ragged, thinned ranks, Charles frowned. "At this rate, the only army I'll have left is the one in my imagination," he muttered. Rupert, overhearing, gave a small, mirthless chuckle. "Well, let's hope our imagination fights as well as Parliament's new model," he quipped. Parliament, meanwhile, wasted no time. They ordered Fairfax to end his siege of Oxford and set out to confront the king. On June 9th, in a dramatic move, Fairfax was finally granted the independence he'd long craved, free from the distant orders of the Committee of Safety. And Cromwell, with his steely resolve and piercing gaze, was now Lieutenant General of Horse, ready to close in on Charles for good. As Charles pressed on, Rupert anxiously penned a letter to Goring, urging him to leave Taunton and join the king for an impending showdown. Unfortunately, Goring's response was hardly the reassurance Rupert sought. "Still tied up here," Goring wrote. "A few more days, and I'll be on my way." But before it could reach the king's hands, the letter fell into the wrong ones, Fairfax's scouts. When Fairfax read Goring's words, a grin spread across his face. This meant the king had no reinforcements coming and was unaware of it. With Goring bogged down in Taunton, Fairfax and Cromwell had the upper hand. They hastened their march, knowing the time for the Royalists was running out. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. The Royalist forces halted just outside Naseby, and a tense silence fell over their ranks. Rupert, for perhaps the first time, seemed cautious, warning the king that a retreat might be wiser. "This is no place for us," he insisted. "Let's regroup. We can always fight another day with a stronger army." But Charles, pride in his eyes and perhaps desperation in his heart, refused to back down. "No," he said firmly. "We stand here. They can bring whatever they want, but today we'll see if they can end this war." As dawn broke over Naseby, the king's army arranged itself for battle. Across the fields, Fairfax and Cromwell took their positions, the new model army bristling with anticipation. In one last moment of reflection, Charles surveyed his soldiers, loyal men, weary and desperate as he was. In the summer of 1645, a misty dawn broke over the fields near Naseby, where two armies braced for one of the most decisive battles of the English Civil War. King Charles I, desperate and nearly cornered, had gambled everything to lead his Royalist army into this last stand. Facing him was the new model army, Parliament's new and formidable fighting force, led by the indomitable General Thomas Fairfax and the feared cavalry commander Oliver Cromwell. On the Royalist side, Charles's army was stretched to its limit. Deprived of reinforcements from the north and worn thin by a long campaign, the Royalists brought around 7,000 men to the field. At their core, 3,500 veteran infantrymen formed two lines of battle, with 2,925 musketeers and 575 pikemen ready to defend their king. Anchoring the left center stood the disciplined regiments of Sir George Lisle, a seasoned commander, and to his right, the regiments of Henry Bard and the Queen's personal lifeguard, gleaming in the morning sun. Prince Rupert's famous bluecoats, 1,700 cavalrymen arrayed in 3 divisions and led in the Swedish style, stood on the right, ready to thunder into the fray under the prince's legendary boldness. On the Parliamentarian side, a sea of red and blue uniforms sprawled across Closter Hill, standing out vividly against the English countryside. With 8,500 infantry organized into 3 disciplined lines, Fairfax had created a solid, unyielding wall of pikes and muskets. The veteran commander Philip Skippon led the foot soldiers with unflinching resolve. Meanwhile, Fairfax kept his reserve ready and watched the battlefield from a strategic distance. Cromwell's 4,000-strong cavalry, the Ironsides, stood on the right wing, embodying the lethal efficiency of Parliament's new fighting style. Henry Ireton, Cromwell's son-in-law, held the left wing with 2,500 cavalry, poised for swift action. As the morning fog lifted around 9:30, Cromwell sat high in his saddle, his cold gaze sweeping across the Royalist lines. By his side, Fairfax rode up, silent but with a look of grave determination. Cromwell, seeing the Royalists lining up on Dust Hill, leaned over and said with steely confidence, "We have the ground, Thomas. Let them come up the hill and we'll drive them down to hell." Fairfax nodded, the faintest grin betraying his own satisfaction with their positioning. "Then let's be ready to send them," he replied, keeping his eyes on the approaching lines. Both men knew they had the advantage, but they also knew how hard Rupert's bluecoats would fight to break their ranks. It didn't take long for Prince Rupert, true to his reputation for rash courage, to make the first move. Spurring his horse forward, he gave the order, and the Royalist cavalry surged ahead like a tidal wave. "England rides with the king," he bellowed, his sword raised as his men thundered down the hill, hoping their speed and fury would shatter Parliament's lines before they could respond. But Cromwell's Ironsides was ready. "Hold steady, men," he shouted, his voice carrying across the field. "This is their fury, not their strength. Let them come." The Parliamentarian cavalry held firm, their lines disciplined and unyielding under the storm of the Royalist charge. When Rupert's men collided with the Ironsides, it was like a hammer meeting an unbreakable anvil. Despite their ferocity, the Royalist cavalry soon faltered, losing momentum against the unflinching Parliamentarian line. Rupert, momentarily stunned, saw his men begin to waver. Desperation in his voice, he yelled to his nearest captains, "Regroup, for the king!" But the Ironsides, well-trained and ruthlessly efficient, counterattacked with lethal precision, driving the Royalists back in disarray. In the center, Fairfax's infantry clashed with the Royalist lines under Sir George Lisle and Henry Bard. The din of musket fire and clashing steel filled the air, and amid the chaos, Fairfax fought alongside his men. At one point, a bullet grazed his cheek, leaving a streak of blood across his face. Wiping it with a grin, he shouted, "I'm still here, and so shall we stand." His bravery had an electrifying effect on his troops, who pressed forward with renewed vigor. Skippon, steadfast and fearless, rallied the foot soldiers. "Stand firm, lads," he roared. They're breaking. His booming voice and steady presence kept the men resolute as they drove the Royalists back, inch by inch. Watching his lines falter, Charles knew he had one last card to play, his reserved lifeguard. With a look of grim determination, he turned to his nearest aide and said, "Send them in. We hold this ground or die trying." But even as his lifeguard advanced, they found themselves outnumbered and overwhelmed. The disciplined ranks of Parliament's infantry closed in around them, and despite their loyalty to the king, they couldn't hold against the coordinated might of Fairfax's forces. Cromwell, seeing the tide turn, raised his sword and ordered his cavalry forward one last time. "This is the day we claim victory for England," he shouted, his voice resonating across the field. With a unified roar, the Parliamentarian cavalry surged forward, shattering what remained of the Royalist lines. Rupert, looking around at the devastation, saw that the day was lost. Riding up to the king, he spoke through gritted teeth, "Your Majesty, we must live to fight another day." Charles, his face pale and his pride shattered, nodded in bitter acceptance. "So be it," he whispered, almost to himself. "This is not the day of our deliverance." As the dust settled, Charles looked over the battlefield, his hopes in ruins. His army lay scattered, his allies either dead or fleeing, and his cause left in tatters. He had risked everything, and had been bested by the disciplined might of the new model army. Retreating with the remnants of his forces, he knew that the days of his royal cause were numbered. Fairfax and Cromwell surveyed the field with satisfaction, their victory hard-won but decisive. Cromwell, with a hint of dark humor, muttered to Fairfax, "Well, I'd say that's a king well drubbed." The two shared a grim smile, knowing that England's future had been decided on the fields of Naseby. The Battle of Naseby was an undeniable disaster for Charles I. His forces had been decimated, his confidence shattered, and his royal aspirations dealt a fatal blow. This battle would lead to his eventual capture and trial, and ultimately to the end of absolute monarchy in England. As for Fairfax and Cromwell, their victory at Naseby symbolized not only military success but a new dawn for England. Cromwell would later reflect, "God's will cannot be denied," his words carrying a sense of triumph and destiny. The Battle of Naseby taught hard lessons on overconfidence, the power of strategy, and the determination to fight for a cause greater than oneself. Charles's belief in his own divine right had blinded him to the voices of his people, ultimately leading to his downfall. Meanwhile, the discipline, resolve, and leadership of Cromwell and Fairfax demonstrated that loyalty and unity could overcome even the most daunting foes. If you're captivated by these stories of courage, strategy, and the tides of history, join us on this journey. Subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell to get updates on our latest releases, and dive into history's most riveting battles. Together, we'll uncover the past that shapes us today.